Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to talk about a recent poll into trust in various media outlets in Britain with some incredibly interesting results when you compare Labour with Conservative voters. In fact, I think you'll be amazed at some of them. I certainly was. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So, YouGov have just released the results of a poll on our news media consumption habits and relative levels of trust. Actually, I may actually be covering a few different polls today, depending on how the schedule works out. But anyway, this one is about the news media, and it had a few results which surprised me in terms of consumption. It should come as no surprise, I think. But in terms of trust, in terms of consumption, the BBC was at the top, followed by the major TV channels, then the mainstream newspapers, and then niche publications like the New European Spectator propping up the bottom. No real surprise there, people preferring to get their news from the television and then maybe newspapers or the newspapers' websites and so on. I didn't seem to feature myself, so I can't really tell you where I rank, I'm afraid. But none of this was really surprising. But the real eye-openers were the results on trust as split into Labour and Conservative voters. In terms of the headline results, the top three trusted sources for Labour voters were Channel 4. Channel 4 actually did quite well. It's trusted by Conservative and Labour voters on balance. But for Labour voters, Channel 4, The Guardian and ITV. The top three trusted sources for the Conservatives were ITV again, The Telegraph and The Times. Now, for Conservative voters, you might wonder, where the Mail or The Express or The Sun were. Were they close behind these top three? They were not. In fact, nowhere near. In fact, and this is what surprised me, the Mail, the Express and the Sun all have negative scores. It'll come as no surprise, very negative scores amongst Labour voters, but they have very negative scores even amongst Conservative voters. Not as negative, of course. In each case, Labour voters way more negative about them. But they are all clearly negative on the trust scale amongst even Conservative voters. Now, that was a bit of an eye-opener because all of those publications exist with the express purpose of persuading people to approve of policies which are against their interests. Lack of trust on these levels suggests they're not actually of that much use to their stable masters. They're shelling out a load of money for not very much, particularly for the Sun, which makes heavy losses. Now, there is another way to look at this, of course. You can say maybe each of these newspapers is trying to target a very particular type of reader, a very small section of the Conservative voter or potential voter base. So they can afford to be mistrusted by the majority of Conservative voters as long as together they are covering enough of the voting public to keep installing a Conservative government. But that's a hypothesis. That's just what I'm thinking of to explain how they can be getting it so badly wrong. But what is clear is that their ability to spread a message amongst their readers is probably limited, because if Conservative voters in general have low levels of trust in these papers, how much less trustworthy are they to non-Conservative voters? And it's worth pointing something else out as well. So if you take The Guardian, not actually a pro-Labour paper, the only real pro-Labour mainstream paper would be The Mirror. But you do see articles and comment pieces which will give Labour a fair hearing just as much as those that will attack it. Maybe in reality they're actually more pro-Labour ones than anti-Labour articles, but it does actually tend to be reasonably fair. But what you're unlikely to ever read in The Guardian is an article or comment piece which even approaches the claim that the Conservatives are ever, at any particular time, the ones most fit for government. You just won't see that in The Guardian. And to reflect this, the level of trust amongst Conservative voters is negative. But it's not that negative. And it's way less negative than for the Sun, the Mail or the Express. I found that remarkable. You get a cross-section of Conservative voters and more of them will pick The Guardian as a trust. If you gave them the Sun, the Mail, the Express and The Guardian, most of them will go for The Guardian. That's remarkable, isn't it? Like I say, it may be that these other publications are very focused on a very particular type of voter, and it doesn't matter if there's collateral damage in terms of lower trust amongst others, but then you look at the Telegraph. The Telegraph has a very strong positive rating amongst Conservative voters, but they push the same sort of lines. You could actually lump the Sun, the Express, the Mail and the Telegraph all into one in terms of the approach they take. You know, not just in terms of pro-Conservative, because that would also apply to the Times, but the Times takes a very different angle to things. You know, those four, Telegraph, Mail, Express and Sun, all sort of, they have different styles. You know, they're trying to target slightly different readers, but they all push the same narrative. And yet the Telegraph manages to maintain a very strong positive rating, suggesting that it is possible to print populist tripe, quite frankly, without strongly disaffecting other compatible political groups. So maybe this is a sign of a rapidly waning influence from some of the mainstream Tory press. I mean, we can see that the Mail are not able to change the public perception at will, because they ran that 2-week campaign last year against Keir Starmer ahead of the 2022 local elections, and it seemed to do nothing to Starmer or Labour's poll ratings. It was just an act of desperation. So maybe when I'm sort of tackling some untruths in the Tory press, I need to focus more on the Telegraph rather than the others, when I decide to expose their latest nonsense. But there were some other interesting results as well. Some publications were trusted by both Labour and Conservative voters, such as the BBC and ITV. But I think the prize goes to the Financial Times. If you add them up, it's not necessarily the biggest score, but it's the only one which had over a +20 rating for both Labour and Conservative voters. And although these results are perceptions, I will say, I think in this case it's deserved. It's true that the Financial Times effectively lobbies, just as other media outlets often do. And the Financial Times is effectively lobbying for investors. It's written for investors, people who own the country. So is it really a friend of Labour and Labour voters? Well, in a weird way, yes. Because I've said many times, like, it's been the best outlet for explaining the realities of Brexit. Straight on it. No messing about. No trying to spin it. For an essentially pro-Conservative outlet, which it is, it has been remarkably frank about the damage of not just Brexit, but a number of Tory policies, particularly economic policies. And this is because the outlet exists to give investors accurate information. It doesn't exist to try and persuade people to vote Conservative. It exists to give investors accurate information. Because if they don't get accurate information, they'll make poor investment decisions, lose money. What's the point in getting the Financial Times if it keeps steering you wrong? So although the group they mostly represent are no friends to those of us in Labour, the paper is, bizarrely, because it publishes the facts. It has to, otherwise it is of no value to its main market. Finally, I want to take a look at two relative newcomers, GB News and Talk TV. GB News at the moment are trying to claim that they're like the most popular news organisation in the country, even though Ofcom, the reason Ofcom don't ban them from hiring Tory MPs as presenters, which is supposed to be illegal, or at least against the regulations, is because they claim it's not a news station, whereas GB News say, oh, we're actually the best news station. That's interesting. But in both cases, despite their own propaganda, mistrusted by Labour voters, but positive trust levels amongst Conservative voters, not by much, but nonetheless positive. GB News, very, very badly mistrusted by Labour supporters. And this is important for looking ahead to the next election. See, if you were to pigeonhole GB News into a supporter of a particular political party, which one does it most align with? It wouldn't actually fit best with the Conservative Party. Yes, there are Tory MPs presenting shows, which is supposed to be against the rules, as I say, but it's only a certain type of Conservative MP fronting those shows. It's not a cross-section. The channel more closely aligns with their top presenter, Nigel Farage, and Nigel Farage is most closely linked with Reform UK. You would almost say that GB News and Reform UK are presenting much the same messages as each other. For all I know, they're even funded by the same people, because I don't know who funds either of them. And consider this in the context of the next general election. So if Labour voters strongly mistrust GB News, then it's likely they will do so with Reform UK, because it's the same messages. If Conservative voters have an overall positive level of trust with GB News, well, they will for Reform UK, or at least their ideas. Yes, most won't vote for Reform UK, even if they like what they have to say, because most voters understand that a general election, it's ultimately a battle royale for government, and there are only two parties in the running. So they opt for the least bad option from many people's point of view. And that would suggest that Reform UK, just like the Brexit party before them, is going to take a much higher proportion of votes from the Conservatives than from Labour. And you would say, well, yeah, you would expect that anyway. But this sort of poll can sort of lead to that conclusion as well. And if Nigel Farage gets involved, and he's hinting that he will right now, but, you know, he's a drama queen, who knows? Then GB News may as well just call itself the Reform UK propaganda channel. You know, I think I'm right in saying he's still by far their biggest viewer magnet. So it could be interesting. These results could be interesting in terms of just how, I think it was the case with the Brexit Party. They always took more votes from the Conservatives than Labour. So even when they took votes from Labour, it was always a benefit to Labour because they took more from the Conservatives, and that was the head-to-head in most of the seats where Reform UK would do well. But in this case, these polls might suggest that Reform UK may actually pull an even higher proportion of Conservative votes compared to Labour votes. Very interesting. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.